Welcome everyone to Studio 43, Transformations in Foundation series, where we discuss the forces that are transforming our lives and which bring us together as people. Today, we're going to be talking about technological transformations and threats. My name is Eva Chang. I'm the Director of Evaluation and Research here at the Bush Center, where, as you might imagine, we take things like technology and data very seriously. As I was thinking about this session, I realized I actually use technology to create a ton of data on a daily basis, and I bet you do too. Let me give you an example. I'm a runner, so this morning I got up, I put on this watch, and I went for a run. When I got home, I used a digital code to get back into my house. I'll be honest with you, I have no idea where the physical key to my house is. By the time I was out of the shower, my watch had uploaded my run data to a service I subscribed to, and I already had a message telling me exactly how many miles I should run tomorrow and how fast I should run them. I also had a text message from a good friend who saw my route, and she said, "Hey, let's meet up this weekend and run that same route." When I got in my car, I asked my car which route should I take to work to avoid the most traffic. Yes, we are talking to our cars now. It's like living with the Jetsons. I also asked my car to go ahead and order my Starbucks because I didn't want to wait in line. My route had a toll road. I get on the toll road, a camera takes a picture of my front license plate. I'm sure a bill is being generated as we speak. It will be sent to me and it will be automatically paid by my bank account. I will never see that bill. I get to Starbucks, my cell phone remembers the Wi-Fi, it connects, I send a quick email, grab my drink, come over to the Bush Center, and I enter this very secure building with an electronic badge. Y'all, look at all that data that I created before 7:30 a.m. this morning. I love data. It's why I have this job. It makes my life easier. However, if I sit and I think about it too hard, it is a little creepy. Where does all that data go? Who has access to it? And what are they using it for? And I had this thought. If I wanted to delete that digital trail that I created this morning, do I even have the authority to do that? And then I hear stories on the news, and I bet you've heard these too. This major bank was hacked. That large corporation lost sensitive customer data. This is one of my favorite, a relatively new Pentagon policy that bans this kind of wearable technology because it turns out that feature I love where my friend can see my route and meet up with me is not such a good idea when you have soldiers running around secure military bases uploading their routes, right? And some governments have taken this too far. In China, they're actually assigning their citizens a social credit ranking based on some of that big data that I mentioned. And what happens if you have a bad ranking score? Well, they will prevent you from getting on trains and planes and traveling inside and outside of the country. So, we're living in an amazing time with amazing technological advances. However, could some of those technological advances be a weakness, not just to me and you individually, but to our national security? So, we have a lot of questions about this that we want answered. Luckily, we have two fantastic experts who are going to come out and help us answer some of these questions. I want to let you know, you will have a chance to answer questions, so have them ready if you have some questions. Our first panelist is Mr. Peter Altabef, Chairman of the Board of Unisys Corporation, and importantly to this discussion, he is a member of the President's National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee, where he co-chairs the Cybersecurity Moonshot Initiative. And if you've never heard about that, that's okay, you're gonna learn about it today. Very importantly, Peter actually just won a very prestigious award called the Eagle Award for his work in helping us make the internet safer. We also have Secretary Michael Chertoff. We all know him as the former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security under President George W. Bush, where he worked on things like border security, immigration policy. He spearheaded the first national cybersecurity initiative. And prior to that, he led the investigation of our 9/11 terrorist attacks. So, will you please help me in welcoming our guests to the stage? Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Chertoff. Okay, thank you. You heard that very scary introduction that I just gave both of you. And in preparing for this session, Secretary Chertoff, I read your book, Exploding Data, Reclaiming Our Cybersecurity in the Digital Age. And one thing that stunned me is how much data we actually produce as individual citizens. So can you talk about what do you think would surprise people in the audience about how their data is being used?
Well, thank you, Eva. And I think people describe data as the new oil or the new gold. It is probably the most precious natural resource. But here's a surprise. Even I got yesterday. I was reading the Washington Post, and there's a story about an application called Ovia, which maybe some of you heard of. Apparently this application, which is essentially commissioned by employers, allows or perhaps pressures employees, female employees, to log everything relating to pregnancies, efforts to get pregnant, how the pregnancy is going, and when the baby is born, birth weight, and all the characteristics of the baby. The idea is presented as this is supposed to help you maximize the possibility of a safe and healthy pregnancy. But the employer gets access to the data, which is theoretically anonymized, but is quite detailed about every facet of your temperature, what you're eating, what your heart rate is, and any indicators with respect to the health of the fetus. All of this becomes part of the app. And for those who want to kind of put a lot of faith in the idea that the data is anonymized, I have two words to say to you: Cambridge Analytica. I mean, the reality is we generate, often willingly, sometimes with only imperfect knowledge, and sometimes completely unwittingly, enormous amounts of data. And the thing to remember is, it's not just kept in silos. It is often combined, either up in the cloud, so there's visibility across all of the silos, or people sell it. There's a marketplace for this. And so that winds up giving a granular view of the way we live, far beyond what even George Orwell could have imagined when he wrote 1984.
And so that's from the individual level, right? We sign up for these apps, we get our data collected. But Peter, tell us about the national perspective. You're in this a lot, you're doing a lot of advising. So what are you seeing from the national perspective, and how are people wrapping their minds around this?
So, Eva, that's a great question. From the national perspective, I think the biggest question we have is, when does the United States have its Sputnik moment around cyber? And by that, Sputnik was the first satellite into space. It went in 1957. Everyone expected it to be an American satellite, and the Russians beat us to it. And that was the wake-up call that started a lot of other things. And the question really is for us, are we going to wait for an actual Sputnik, or are we going to start acting now ahead of that? So, you know, one could argue 2014, 21 million Americans had their records stolen. And the records went very deep. Almost all federal employees, people with security clearances. My security clearance file's 100 pages. It's gone. So that wasn't enough for us to have a Sputnik moment. To the Secretary's point about personal data, in 2017, we had 148 million Americans lost their Equifax credit data. But it was more than just credit reports. It was social security numbers, it was telephone numbers, it was addresses, it was pretty deep. None of that has moved us as a country. So there's a framework called the CIA Triad. And CIA is not the intelligence division. It's confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility. And so when we think of confidentiality, it's exactly what the Secretary was just talking about. People taking data, people taking the OPM data, people taking the Equifax data, people taking the biology data that the Secretary referred to. That doesn't seem to be enough to trigger this Sputnik moment. So the next level of that triad is integrity. So what happens when we move from someone taking data to actually manipulating that data and then using it back at us for bad purposes? As an example, you're a hospital patient, and you're someone that is either a target of someone who wants to do harm, or it's just a terrorist who wants to make an example of you. And you have a certain blood type. Well, they've infiltrated the data. On the operating table, they change the blood type. So the surgeon thinks that you have a different blood type and gives you different blood. So that would be a manipulation of the data. The third would be accessibility. And so that obviously we're aware that certain countries have infected our power grid with software and firmware. It's not being used today. But if that software and firmware were to be used, and if it was effective, which is unknown, then you could have an accessibility problem in shutting the power grid. So 2 countries have had their Sputnik moment. So Estonia with an attack on their financial system, and Ukraine with an attack on their power system. If you live in Estonia or the Ukraine today, you've had your Sputnik moment. They are extremely aware of these issues. The real question for us is, do we wait or do we act now?
And by the way, just to add on the integrity example you gave, imagine you have an automated system that is handling your blood transfusion or some kind of infusion therapy, and that has the data altered, and there's not even a human being to look at it and kind of raise a question about it.
So that's great. And Peter, you brought up the bad guys. And I think we've all seen the scary movie where a terrorist takes over our grid. And it reminds me of this morning when our CEO, Ken Hirsch, was talking about this Geneva Convention idea that we have for international warfare. So Michael, what do you think about that? Are there norms currently for this kind of attack? Should there be norms? And if so, what's an example of one of those norms?
Well, there's a bit of a dispute, not surprisingly, between the Western countries and Russia and China about the applicability of international law to cyber conflict. I won't say cyber warfare. The Russians and the Chinese are more skeptical. I think most Western countries believe that the traditional laws of war and armed conflict would apply in cyberspace. The challenge is deciding when you've crossed the threshold between ordinary cyber malicious activity into the realm of conflict. But there's also a more general issue about norms, whether there are some things even the Russians and the Chinese could agree with the West about. For example, there's work being done, I'm somewhat involved in this, in developing norms on not attacking the availability or integrity of data on the financial system, the global financial system. And because every country in the global economy needs to use that system in order to transact business, there may be enough of a shared interest that you could get a global agreement on this. Or, for example, the Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace, which I'm co-chairing, has published a norm on protecting the public core of the internet, trying to get general acknowledgement that we don't take steps that would undermine the general availability or integrity of the internet as it functions globally. So I'm without being naive or Pollyannish, I do think there are areas of shared interest, but frankly, because of the difficulties you have sometimes in drawing lines on where a cyber attack begins or how you attribute, it's going to be more complicated than in the physical world.
So, and you mentioned businesses have an interest in agreeing to this. What about governments? Do governments also have a shared interest in signing up for these norms?
I think so, because governments also depend on the availability of, for example, a public core to deliver basic services. So in much the same way as most countries agree, except for rogue nations, agreeing with the general outlines of the Geneva Convention, even if they're not always honored, I think there's enough mutual interest in some of these norms so that governments will have an incentive to participate. In many ways, though, the private sector may lead. And because much of the infrastructure is in private hands, that's actually a very powerful issue. We've seen it in our own country, where a number of the cyber companies decided after the Snowden revelations that they were going to be very transparent and punctilious about making sure that whenever there was a request from the government to access data, it was done strictly according to the law, turning square corners. And that's actually had a real impact in the world. So the companies really can be leaders in this.
That's great, okay. So Peter, let's talk about our government. I mentioned when I was introducing you that you co-chair the Cybersecurity Moonshot Committee, and I'm just interested to learn more about that, and where does your work stand now?
Well, thanks, Eva. You know, to follow on Michael's comment, we early on in the creation of the National Cybersecurity Moonshot Project realized while it should be led by the government, it can't be a government effort. So industry, academia, people, it's really what we call a whole of nation effort. We think that's necessary. The defining statement of the Moonshot is to create a safe and secure internet for critical services by 2028. Safe and secure doesn't mean perfect. There's not going to be perfection, but it's demonstrably different than where we are now. It is about the internet, because that's where all of this commerce takes place. It is about critical services, which is what the Secretary just referred to, whether it's critical government services, the financial sector. And 2028 is a really important part of that. So we purposefully picked 10 years out for a couple of reasons. The first reason is there's so much important work being done in cybersecurity every day. You have companies doing patches, you have government agencies strengthening their system, but they're patches. You have 5 days to deal with a zero-day vulnerability. You really only have limited tools. The tools you have are technology. If you go out 10 years, all of a sudden, you're not limited to just technology patches. You can look at all of the tools that we have as a society. We'll talk about that in a second. The second reason for going out 10 years is there's a bit of that Ken talked about as well this morning, which is the unknowable. So we really wanted to set up a framework which includes an organization, it includes a methodology, it includes funding. It's the whole package of how are we as a society going to stand up the ability not only to deal with the threats we have today, but the threats that we foresee coming, such as the ability of quantum computers to basically obliterate any existing encryption, but also threats we don't see yet. So it is really, how do we establish as a society, we care enough about this that we're going to do it right. And so when we did that, interesting things happened. Technology is important, and we identified 4 key technologies that we knew were both offensive and defensive, in the sense that if we use them correctly, we could use these technologies to protect ourselves. But the bad guys could absolutely use these technologies to attack us. So these are double-edged swords. 5G network is one, artificial intelligence the second, biometrics the third, and the fourth is kind of the big kahuna, which is quantum computing, which Ken also talked about this morning. So we really focused on those 4 technologies, but we went beyond technology. So the next thing we focused on, out of these 6 pillars, was privacy. So how do we build privacy into the next generation of how we establish protections on the internet from the get-go? Not as an afterthought, but build it in now. And in a second way, how do we think about privacy from the standpoint of accountability and responsibility? So how do we make sure that we protect against this kind of data that the Secretary talks about from being misused? The third pillar was education. And we've dealt with education really 2 ways. The first is, how do we make sure that as a society, we know what good cyber hygiene is? All right? There's an education to tell people what that means. The second part of education is really the capabilities we have in terms of the people who can build these next generation systems. Do we have enough people going through STEM classes in high school, in college? When people graduate college or graduate school, and if they happen to be foreign students, do we hand them a green card and say, we want you to stay and help us? So education is one of those elements. The next element, and the fourth element, was really interesting. It was human behavior. And I got to tell you, sitting in these briefings with these wonderful leading technologists and having them sit in the same room as academics who really understand human behavior was kind of a revelation. So you can educate people on what good cyber hygiene is, but will they actually do it? So the human behavior pillar is about getting people to understand the importance of it and then doing it. The last two are what you'd expect, I think, and one of them is policy. And so as we think about incentives, whether it's for industry, whether it's for people, whether it's government agencies, what laws and regulations, what kind of policy do we have to adopt that basically says, this is our moonshot for the 21st century, this is our thing. And then the final pillar is what we call ecosystems, because none of the other pillars actually works as a standalone. You have to get in the seams of these and really understand how do you put it all together. Last element, Eva, going back again to Ken's comment, the one big difference between the original moonshot and what we have now is when President Kennedy announced it, we did not have all the technology to actually get a person to the moon and safely back. He didn't know how we were going to do it. We as a country did not know. But we did know where the moon would be. We knew exactly where it was going to be at any moment of time for the next 100 years. With our moonshot, similarly, we don't have all the technology answers, but we actually don't know exactly where this moving target is going to be. So it has to be a very robust company or countrywide effort, because we're going to have to be nimble, and we're going to have to realize that this is going to change during the course of those 10 years.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And you actually caught my attention when you talked about human behavior. Because I know I'm supposed to drink a certain amount of water and exercise a certain amount of time to stay healthy, but I don't do it, right? So can you give us an example of one of those human behaviors that was brought up that people might not use, even though we know we're supposed to?
Well, if you think about, at a basic individual level, one of the most important things you can do is patch early and patch often. So, and of course, then there's password maintenance and all of that. So there are, pretty obvious things that you just need to make sure people understand, why is it important to patch? Why is it important to have a good password structure? Why is it good not to have all of your technology or all of your information in one place? But then you have to get people inspired to do it. Right. We're coming up with videos. We're coming up with other ways to actually get people to really kind of understand it and then want to actually do it. We're trying to make it fun. So
I'm betting a whole bunch of people are going to be changing their passwords and making them more secure after the session, right? So Michael, how is this different? The recommendations he's talking about, these are brand new. You just handed them to the president, as I understand it. How does this sound different or very similar to when you spearheaded a campaign like this?
Well, we've been talking about doing this for years, and the message has been out for years. And I think one of the things we need to think about is maybe we need to also design the systems to be a little more human-friendly. So let me take the two examples that Peter just gave. The reality is everybody knows you're supposed to have a very long password and a different password for every account and change them frequently. How many people are actually capable of doing that and remembering if they have a lot of different accounts? We actually need to start to think about moving to a system of identity management that is less complicated and doesn't rely on some secret knowledge of a password or a code, but is based on some combination of biometrics, behavior, the nature of the device, and a number of different things that don't require a lot of human effort. That's designing a more user-friendly system. Or on the issue of patches. How do you assure people when they get something that appears to be a legitimate patch, it's actually not malware masquerading as a patch? So part of the challenge here, to be honest, is on those who are designing the security elements to think through what you pointed out earlier, the psychology of human beings. We're not designing for engineers who spend a lot of time loving how complicated things can be. We're designing them for civilians who need to be able to operate in the real world.
Right, exactly. And so I promised this group that I was going to open it up to questions. We do have mic runners going up and down the aisle. So this is your opportunity to ask those burning questions you have that have been brought up as we've had this session to two of our great experts here. So let's see what questions we might have from the audience. And it's a little hard to see, so I'll thank you for the lights. Okay, we have one back here. The microphone's coming. Because we're live feeding this, we're going to wait until the microphone gets to you to make sure everybody online can hear your question.
Hi, thank you. I have a question because I think about my mother every day and her iPhone, which she doesn't need, and her iPad, which she also doesn't need. She still has an AOL email account. She opens attachments. What can I do, or where can I send her educationally to make her understand that when you click on that attachment, someone may end up with your credit card number, or God forbid, whatever personal information that you have, which is all in your iPhone, which I wish you wouldn't have bought in the first place.
Well, that's a great question. Now, they are designing and marketing various kinds of devices now that are much simpler. In fact, I saw an ad for something that basically, this is designed to get people to kind of spend less time on the screen, but essentially it's a telephone and texting. It doesn't have access to the internet, it doesn't have email, and therefore the amount of data on it is less. I actually think there's a market for that. And it may be that the answer is to find for someone who either doesn't need or perhaps shouldn't need access to all the data and keeping it in one place, something that can certainly be there for emergencies and for communication that you need to have, but isn't going to be a repository of data that's as attractive to a bad guy as what you're describing.
And again, just to follow up, that iPhone that she has, she doesn't need it now, but she probably will need it in the future. Because when we talk about the passwords, one of the four critical technologies that we have identified for the moonshot is biometrics. And that is all about moving away from a password that nobody can remember to basically giving you a score based on all of how you hold the phone, where you are, how you punch the buttons. I mean, there's a whole lot of data you can get that really makes sure it's you. And unfortunately, you don't have all of that with just a PC on a desk. So even people who are using PCs one day may actually have to authenticate with a phone because there's just so much more data on that phone. Anyone here who thinks that their mother's maiden name is a good password? It is not. In fact, it's hard to really think about when you use your mother's maiden name for almost anything, but not for a password. They're known things out there.
So I have elementary age children who are dying for cell phones, right? And I think I'm going to start calling them repositories of data instead of cell phones, just to get that idea across that they hold so much data. I think we had a question here in the front row.
So the current version of the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act expires at the end of 2020. We're beginning discussions now with various components of the federal government. Cyber was really not at the level of threat 5 years ago. The last version was done, certainly not in 2001 when it was first created after 9/11. And we as the insurance industry are trying to have conversations with Treasury on this, and I would just encourage you to recognize the need to collaborate with Treasury because it may be a little bit siloed in the areas that you're working on. But I suspect cyber threats are going to be even more important as we talk about fundamental disruptions to the U.S. economy in the next 5 years than it has been in the previous 5 years.
So if I could just start. It's a great question. You're right. This is a newer question than we've had before. About 20% of the significant cyber attacks are now associated with nation-state action. And so one of the insurance questions, because insurance is critical for companies, and cyber insurance is becoming more and more important, is a typical insurance policy has an exception for an act of war. And so, you know, will typical insurance companies for cyber actually protect companies when they need it most, which is when they're actually attacked by the most powerful of enemies, which are nation states? So I raise that as a question that is very much at the forefront of some of these discussions.
Now, what's going to be complicated about that is, of course, when is something an act of war? What is war? And what do you do with hybrid warfare, where, for example, as in Estonia, the Russians, when we called them on the 2007 attack on Estonia, said, oh, it wasn't us, it was patriotic hackers. Now, if you've read some of the indictments that came out of the Mueller investigation, you see the Russian intelligence agency and the criminal groups actually work like this together. Something else that would be helpful, though, we have the Safety Act for counterterrorism technologies, which, if you satisfy certain metrics, means that you get a liability cap. If notwithstanding your technology, there's a successful attack. I've advocated we ought to have that for cyber, which means we ought to have a set of standards, and then technologies or processes that meet those standards should afford the company or the enterprise some cap on liability, which would then make it easier to insure them.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Oh, up here in the front.
It's a fascinating topic. We're all getting paranoid, you know. I feel like my phone is listening to me, my TV's watching me. In fact, I can merely talk about a destination now, and an ad for that trip shows up on my Facebook. So is that true, and how do we protect ourselves?
Well, unfortunately, it is a little true. You know, there have been stories about Echo and similar types of devices you have in your home that are you're supposed to say, you know, Echo or Siri or whoever, or Alexa, you know, turn on the TV, that sometimes these wind up recording you. And there was one story about someone who was recorded, and then the recording was sent to a third party. Some of these are design problems. Some of these, to be honest, particularly as you get to the Internet of Things, are questions for you about, do you really want this device? I mean, I got to be honest, I'm perfectly capable of turning on the TV myself. I don't need Echo or Alexa to do it for me. So part of my argument to people is you ought to be mindful. Where technology is important and helpful to you, and I do wear an Apple Watch, that's great. But I wouldn't blindly accept the view that we want to be having ourselves surrounded by smart devices when the risk-reward ratio may be suboptimal. That's good.
That may be the
Well, and there have been stories even about televisions being able to detect, for example, where your eyes are when a particular ad is on, so that the vendor can determine what kinds of ads are more compelling to you. And it may be at some point we do wind up with legislation or regulation that says you must tell the consumer with clarity exactly what is being done with their data and what is being collected as a condition of being able to sell. In much the same way as you have to list ingredients for food that have to be accurate.
Right. So now we're all pretty terrified, I think. But this session is called Technological Transformations, and I talked about how we're living in an amazing time. So let's end it with you telling us what you're excited about, right? Because this technology does help us. It makes our life easier. It makes us healthier. So you pick the order you want to go in, but tell us what you're excited about.
I'll start, I guess. This is a two-edged conversation. We have to be deliberate. We have to invest the time and any energy and money to protect ourselves, but we can't run scared. Ken mentioned again in the first speech the importance of our system of government, the importance of democracy, the importance of our economy, and this capitalism, right? We encourage innovation. We encourage movement of capital. It's okay for people to fail in this world, and then you restart. All of that gives us a tremendous advantage in using these technologies to create jobs, to build new economies, and to advance humanity. We're 21 years into the Google search engine. We have not yet hit a dozen years for the iPhone. And you now have most of the knowledge of humanity literally at your fingertips. So where we go with that is it's hugely positive. The four technologies I mentioned earlier, very quickly. So 5G. 5G creates a mesh network. It's much faster, it's much more reliable. It will be the enabler for autonomous cars. Autonomous cars don't really become fully enabled on wide scale without 5G. Biometrics is going to make us much more secure than your mother's maiden name, right? Artificial intelligence. We may not all use Alexa. Alexa is 4 years old. And so, we've gone from, the excitement of being able to say, I want to hear a specific song, to, voice recognition has enormous potential. And all of this kind of takes a backseat to quantum. You heard about the computing power of quantum. There are already studies about what it will do to machine learning. There are already studies about what it will do to genetic research. So yes, you have the downside of it could defeat current encryption. You have to build quantum protected encryption. And then you have to go do all the good stuff. So I would say we need not lose our courage. We have the right system of government. We've got the right economy. We are just missing a focus on helping us defend ourselves.
I agree with that. I think, look, I mean, I may make a little bit of fun at the expense of Alexa and Echo, but in the area of health, for example, in the area of the environment and mitigating climate change, things of that sort, we're going to find tremendous potential with some of these technological tools, which will both make us more efficient and healthier. I mean, one example is it may be we're at the point now that when you have an atrial fibrillation, which is a very episodic type of heart ailment that can ultimately cause a stroke, the ability to wear a device that would detect that and have an emergency vehicle come right away will become a life-saving thing. So I do think there's a lot of potential. There's now discussion about smart cities, which would reduce pollution, and make energy use more efficient, and actually make life more pleasant because you won't have to wait in traffic. That being said, I think there's an important dimension to this. Security has to be built in by design. What has not worked in the past is let's push something out to the consumer, and then afterwards we'll think, oh, by the way, we didn't secure it, or we didn't think about how it gets controlled, and now we've got to run around and retrofit it. So to me, there's still an enormous amount of promise in this, but the promise requires us to be thinking about issues like security and privacy at the design stage and at the implementation stage. Finally, I'd say this. You don't have to aspire to perfect security, that you'll never get penetrated. I guarantee you, no matter how good the security is, you will. Just like you can't ask your doctor, doctor, how can I make sure I never get sick? You're going to get sick. That's why you have defenses in depth. You have an immune system. We need to build immune systems within our technology. We will be penetrated, but that's where resilience and internal defenses allow you to mitigate the problem and to recover from it. And so a realistic understanding of what security means, coupled with an appropriate design stage, I think allows us to really capitalize on the promise of this technology.
Okay, perfect. And one of the things that makes me feel hopeful after getting to know both of you is I truly think we have some of the brightest minds in our country and in the world thinking about these issues really deeply. So I do have one more announcement for you, but before that, can you thank me for, join me in thanking our panelists for joining us and spending their time on this topic with us today. So here's my important announcement. You get a break. So we're going to take a quick break. We're going to be back here in the auditorium at 2:15. Don't forget about the delicious snacks in the lounge, but you do want to be back here right at 2:15 because we'll be doing the presentation of the George W. Bush Institute Military Citation and the keynote with Dr. Henry Kissinger, which is supported by our Starking Hearing Technologies supporter today. So just be back here. Have a great break. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute, Holly Kuzmich.
Well, welcome back from the break, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the 2 Studio 43 panels that we had going on. If you'd like to watch the session that you were not available to attend, please know it's on our Bush Center YouTube channel for you to view later. It's my pleasure to introduce Dennis Muhlenberg from Boeing, who's going to kick off our afternoon session. And really, he's going to kick us off with the beginning of the Military Service Initiative Citation. Boeing has been a really generous supporter of our work at the Bush Institute on leadership, and particularly the work of our Military Service Initiative. They were an early champion of what we call our Stand To Veteran Leadership Program. That's our leadership program we started last year to work with leaders across our country who are serving veterans. And you're going to hear from one of our program alums in just a few minutes. So we're really pleased that Dennis was able to be here today to kick off this part of our program. He's chairman, president, and CEO of the Boeing Company. He's obviously a busy guy right now. He's had a lot going on and a lot on his plate. So please join me in welcoming Dennis Muhlenberg to the stage.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and good afternoon. And thank you, Mr. President, Mrs. Bush, for bringing together such a distinguished group of people to address this responsibility we all have as global citizens to make positive change in the world. It's indeed my privilege to be here with you today. It's an honor to be here and congratulate somebody who has embraced this responsibility fully of giving back to the world, Tête. He's a recipient of the George W. Bush Institute Military Service Citation this year. And Dylan, your work at Bastion Community of Resilience is innovative and inspiring, and I admire your dedication to supporting your fellow veterans when they return home from service, a commitment that's shared both by the Bush Institute and by the Boeing Company. At Boeing, we make an effort to invest in and engage with our military members, their families, and their communities. Last year, we raised more than $30 million to support military and veteran organizations and their efforts. 2018 also marked the start of our partnership with the Bush Institute, which has been just a tremendous experience. That included a $10 million multi-year donation to the Military Service Initiative, which includes support for the Stand To Veterans program. Boeing is proud to join with the Bush Institute in honoring the service and sacrifice of our post-9/11 veterans and their families and supporting their transition back to civilian life. We recognize it's a big change and not always an easy one, which is why we help veterans translate their military skills into the workplace. Our team includes about 20,000 veterans at Boeing, approximately 15% of our workforce, and we appreciate the values, the leadership, the integrity, and the critical skills that they bring to our company. Now, whether you're talking about the armed forces or companies like Boeing, the investments we make in people are the most important investments that we make. To win in business or on the battlefield, strong, values-based leadership is necessary to navigate confidently through times of change. At Boeing, we understand that lives literally depend on the work that we do, and that requires the utmost excellence and integrity in how we do that work. We consider our Boeing enduring values of quality, safety, and integrity, among others, integral to our work, especially in difficult times like those that we face now. We were devastated by the recent Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 and Lion Air 610 tragedies. We continue to mourn those who were on board and extend our deepest sympathies to their loved ones. All of us feel the immense gravity of these events across our company, and frankly, these last few weeks have been the most heart-wrenching of my career. Our values are at the very core of everything we do. Yet we know we can always be better, and these recent accidents have intensified our commitment to continuous improvement as we design, build, and support the safest airplanes in the sky. That's our responsibility as a leader in the aerospace industry. That's what we do at Boeing. We own it. As our veterans know so well, how you respond to a tough situation will make all the difference to your organization and your country. Our leadership values always apply, even more when the pressure is on and our character is being tested. And this experience has reinforced that truth for us at Boeing. We're humbled and we're learning. We're resilient and we're resolute. And we will never waver in our commitment. The importance of our work demands it. These enduring values drive our behaviors, and I'll briefly share 4 key ones with you today. First, it's important to communicate clearly and openly. In the weeks since the Ethiopian Airlines accident, I've spent even more time with our teams, traveling frequently, walking the floor, and meeting with those who are working on the front lines of our 737 airplane program. I've encouraged leaders throughout our company to do the same with their global teams. It's important that people's concerns are heard and that their questions are answered. In times like these, it's not possible to over-communicate, and I've been updating our people frequently as details emerge and are available, and when it's appropriate to do so, aligned with our international aviation protocol. As we learn the facts, I've also reached out to our airline customers, partners, and communities in open letters and videos to share our support of the investigations and the steps underway to avoid future accidents and our ongoing priority to safety. Second, it's a focus for all of our leaders to invest in our team and empower others. As we continue working closely with our airline customers and global regulators to return the 737 MAX to service, I'm focused on making the adjustments necessary to allow our teams to prioritize additional resources and focus on the recovery efforts. From the days immediately following the Lion Air accident, our top engineers and technical experts have been working tirelessly in collaboration with the Federal Aviation Administration and our customers to finalize and implement a software update that will ensure accidents like these never happen again. The update will make the 737 MAX even safer by preventing erroneous angle of attack sensor readings from triggering the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS, something that initial investigation reports indicate occurred in both MAX accidents, as one link in a longer chain of events. We know we can break this chain link. It's our responsibility to eliminate this risk. We're taking a comprehensive, disciplined approach and taking the time to make sure that we get it right. Third, we must deliver results with excellence in all that we do. I joined our Boeing test pilots last week aboard a 737 MAX flight for a demonstration of this updated software. During the flight, the crew performed different scenarios that exercised the software changes in multiple flight conditions. The software update functioned as designed, and I was impressed by the work and professionalism of our team. Overall, our team has made 96 flights, totaling a little over 159 hours of airtime with this updated software. They will conduct additional test and production flights in the coming weeks, and we continue to demonstrate that we've identified and met all certification requirements. We look forward to completing near-term milestones on the path to final certification. Finally, it's about building lasting relationships based on trust and integrity. We know every person who steps aboard one of our airplanes places their trust in us. We'll do everything possible to earn and re-earn that trust and confidence from our airline customers and the flying public in the weeks and months ahead. We take the responsibility to build and deliver airplanes that are safe to fly and can be safely flown by every single one of the professional and dedicated pilots all around the world. My team and I are working closely with our customers to answer their questions, get their feedback, and ensure those who operate the MAX are prepared when the grounding is lifted and the fleet returns to flight. To that end, we hosted more than 200 regulators and airline officials for an informational session in Seattle last month. And over the last 2 weeks, we've concluded similar meetings in the UK, Singapore, and China with international airline pilots and investigators. Pilots and leaders from 67% of our more than 50 MAX customers and operators around the world have participated in simulator sessions that included the new software update. We want everyone to be confident and that additional training and educational resources we're developing and deploying will do the job. This confidence is important also to our airline's pilots and team members, including the thousands who live here in the Dallas-Fort Worth community, working for American Airlines and Southwest, and those working in Houston who support United Airlines. We regret the impact that grounding has had on all of our airline customers and their passengers. When I started at this great company more than 3 decades ago, our amazing people inspired me. I see how they dedicate their lives and extraordinary talents to connect, protect, explore, and inspire the world safely. And that purpose and mission has only grown stronger over the years. Our team is determined to keep improving on safety in partnership with the global aerospace community and our broader stakeholders. It's this shared sense of responsibility for the safety of flight that spans and binds us all together. Our leadership role is clear, our commitment is resolute, and our pursuit of excellence is never ending. We own it. In these challenging times, I am even more confident in our team and our customers. We'll stay true to our values, and we will come through this even stronger. I hope all of you leave today's forum feeling inspired and empowered to face even the most difficult challenges. Thank you. Thank you. And Mr. President, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I appreciate your leadership. I've learned a lot from you over the years, so thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Richard Casper. He's co-founder of Creative Vets, a nonprofit that helps veterans recover through music and art. Richard is a U.S. Marine, an artist who struggled to adjust during his transition from the military to civilian life, and he's discovered that creative arts are a way to heal. He was selected as a member of the Bush Institute's inaugural Stand To Veterans Leadership Program, and through that program, he has successfully scaled and expanded Creative Vets. Richard is a great example of why Boeing is proud to support the great work that's being done here at the Bush Institute. We are honored to be your partner. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Richard Casper.
Thank you all so much for having me. I'm going to pick up my safety blanket. I'll be using this in a minute. I can't thank you guys enough for having me speak today and to try to inspire. And he said a lot of what I was already going to say, but Creative Vets is a nonprofit that does help combat disabled veterans heal through the arts and the music. We have 2 major programs right now. Our art program, where we enroll combat veterans into the best art schools in the country to teach them how to tell their story through art. So we'll take a veteran from anywhere in the country. In fact, we've helped 2 Native American Marines from the Blackfeet tribes of Montana, flew them to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago to study art for the first time in order to tell their story in a school environment to where they had a syllabus, they were treated like normal students, but they got to learn how to tell their story through art. After that, we display their art at a museum so they can start talking at the National Veteran Art Museum in Chicago, where they get to talk with civilians and veterans alike about their experiences in a way that they couldn't have before. They could hide their stories in this art. And so our second program, which is a more popular program to the veterans, is our songwriting program. So we bring combat disabled veterans from anywhere in the country to Nashville, Tennessee. And we sit down with pro songwriters, and they get to tell their story for the first time in peer-to-peer mentorship. Sometimes the veteran will come there and say, hey, I can't tell my wife this, but I went through this, or this happened to me. But the day after we write the song, the first person they text that song to is their wife. And they're like, babe, listen to my song. I just wrote a song in Nashville, but it's their story. So first question I usually get after I tell people what I do, they're like, well, how'd you come up with that? That's a really cool idea, but how'd you come up with that? And the underlying question is, why are you the one that came up with that and nobody else? So boom, why me? So in 2006, 2007, my Humvee was hit by 4 separate IEDs, which left me with a left traumatic brain injury, and my buddy was shot and killed beside me. And so when I transitioned, I didn't know what to do when I left. If 0 was killing yourself and 100 was you before war, I was at about a 9. It was only my faith in God that really kept me above sea level. So, but I knew I needed to be better, and I didn't know if the VA, the stuff they were doing wasn't helping. So I decided I needed to take a different route. And at a local community college, I discovered art. I went for business. I was like, I'm going to be a businessman. Started failing the classes because of my brain injuries, my anxieties. I actually had to do one-on-one speeches with my speech teacher because I couldn't get up in front of class of these 18 and 19-year-old kids because that's how bad my anxieties were. And so now I'm in this art class for the first time saying, I want to tell my story, but I can't talk about it, and I don't want to talk about it. And I was doing this drawing up that you'll see up on this board. It's a chalk pastel. And so I'm sitting here, I'm doing everything in color like it's supposed to be, and it gets to the time where I'm supposed to do the grass, which obviously is green. The teacher comes up to me and says, hey, how about instead of doing the grass green, do it something that doesn't make sense to you, but it makes sense the way you feel. And I was like, that sounds dumb. This is really good. Have you seen this thing? It looks really good. I don't want to change this up. Because at the time, I didn't understand how art could affect me. And so I just did, as a good Marine, I just led on, did everything red. And so then they come up to me, the students, when I put this piece up, they say, you put red in there because you watched your friend die. You put red in there because you loved him. You put red in there because you're mad that he died. Every one of these things made sense to me. It put me on my feet. Put me on my butt, really. I was like, this is insane because these civilians know what I'm saying, and I never said a word. So I knew there had to be programs that existed that allowed combat veterans like myself into the doors of these art schools to help tell my story for the first time. And because of limited time, I'm going to move to the next slide. I just want you guys to know because I'm so grateful. My story is a long one, but that's a little snippet, but it's only getting bigger and better because of what the Bush Institute has done. Since I enrolled, we have all these new programs and new partners. So now not only do veterans get a flight to Nashville, they get a right backstage at the Grand Ole Opry, where nobody else gets access to. They get to tell their story back there. We just partnered with Zach Brown's Camp Southern Ground to offer curriculum for all the veterans going through their programs. We now are enrolling veterans into the University of Southern California to do art for the first time. And none of this was in existence before I started and got accepted to the Bush Leadership Program. And I just graduated in November. So imagine how much more we can do as we keep going up there. So I thank you so much for this opportunity. But I'm going to end it with a song. It's going to make you all sad. It's a song that we wrote for a veteran. He came to town. He's a Navy corpsman, and so a lot of people don't know what a Navy corpsman is, but it's a medic. So Army medics, Navy corpsman. He said that I really want to talk about not just me, but everyone. Like I went through a situation where I was going through some crap, but I want people to understand that it's not just me. The moment I help them, I put them on the chopper, then there's corpsmen on the chopper. Then once they get to the hospital, there's medics in the hospital. He's like, I want a song that talks about all that, but it wraps around my life. And one of the greatest things about this song is it got played on YouTube, has over 1 million hits, and it brought 5 veterans who've never sought help before to our programs because they heard this song and it made them leave their house because they wanted to tell their own story. So this song is called They Call Me Doc, and you're not supposed to sing after you eat, so I'm sorry. They call me Doc, I ain't got no degree. When it hits the fan, they're calling for me. From bluegrass, Kentucky, red blood on my hands. Nobody calls me hero except for my friends. Well, I woke up from dreams to find out they were real. I can tell you how it looks, I can't tell you how it feels. Yeah, I've seen it all, watched heroes who fall, pick them up till they stand tall. I've been in the field, worked down to the bone, make sure all my buddies get back home. I've shared the smiles, I've shed the tears, swore they'd make it out of here. When they scream, please make it stop. They call me Doc, They all know my name, stitched on this chest, hangs from these chains. You won't read it in the paper, see it on the TV. I don't need no fame, it's fine by me. Yeah, when they're broken, bruised, I know just what I do. My job always starts when their job is through. Yeah, I've seen it all, watched heroes who fall, pick them up till they stand tall. I've been in the field, worked down to the bone, make sure all my buddies get back home. I've shared the smiles, I've shed the tears, swore they'd make it out of here. When they scream, please make it stop, they call me Doc. They call me Doc. Now you'll never know the heartache of looking a grown man in the eye when he asks, am I gonna make it? And you've gotta lie. They call me Doc, I ain't got no degree. But when it hits the fan, they're calling for me. From bluegrass, Kentucky, red blood on my hands. Nobody calls me hero except for my friends. They call me Doc. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you guys so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
How about Richard Casper, huh? Unbelievable. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Matt Amidon, and I simply have the great honor of being the director of the Military Service Initiative here, where we get to focus our work on post-9/11 warriors and their families. As many of you know, this post-9/11 era represents the first time our nation has fought an extended conflict with an all-volunteer force. Since that day, over 3 million service members have deployed overseas to Iraq, Afghanistan, or other theaters of conflict. But what these 18 years reveal is that our post-9/11 warriors and their families have answered the call and continue to do so, volunteering to serve and to serve during a time of great danger. We honor one of those warriors today as the second recipient of the George W. Bush Institute Military Service Citation. Now, this generation of warrior family is defined by resilience, mission first, never accepting defeat, and never leaving a fallen comrade behind. And we say warrior family because it's the family that serves, deploys, and transitions. We at MSI are focused on fostering that successful transition from military to civilian life, and there are 3 imperatives that guide us. One is the moral and social that you all know so well. Simply, it's the right thing to do. But it is a national security issue and the imperative to preserve our all-volunteer force. But finally, it is about global competitiveness and civic leadership. Our men and women come home, and they will lead in our businesses and in our communities. And while every transition is unique, there are 3 things that guide us: optimizing health and well-being and leveraging meaningful education and employment opportunities. This is where MSI focuses our work, not just because it's the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do. We work with all stakeholders, leveraging what we think is a very unique platform and ability to establish a common vision and collaborative action through 4 program areas. Our health and well-being program is focused on the invisible wounds of war through our Warrior Wellness Alliance. You just saw the 2nd year of our one-of-a-kind Veteran Leadership Program is aimed at individuals helping our nation's veterans who want to improve their impact And again, Richard Casper is an exemplar of exactly that. Our economic opportunity work provides veterans the resources to plan for their transition, not just to the next job, but the next career. And finally, our Team 43 sports and family program highlights the service, sacrifice, and resilience of some of our most severely wounded warriors and their families. And we do that through our Warrior Open Golf Tournament and our Warrior 100 bike ride. But in the end, along with success and transition, our work here at the Bush Institute, inspired by President and Mrs. Bush, is about continued leadership. Now, we know the vast majority of our warrior families transition successfully and embrace their next leadership opportunity, and our nation truly benefits. But where does this thing called transition occur? It is an event. You have to take the uniform off someday. But the real transition for our warriors happens in the communities and homes they return to. And this is where the positive change really happens, and this is where veteran leadership in our communities truly benefits many. This includes the proud Gentilly neighborhood of New Orleans, where today stands a new community focused on easing that transition for those who answered the call to serve. Bastion Community of Resilience supports returning warriors and families by providing a healing environment within an intentionally designed neighborhood. 58 families on 5.5 acres, Bastion provides an array of support, from mentorship to meal preparation, all with the goal of promoting independence, wellness, and life satisfaction. Let's take a look.
I created Bastion in response to the epidemic of traumatic brain injury as a result of the use of improvised explosive devices in the war on terror. We are saving lives on the battlefield much better than we did in the past. And as a result, warriors are sustaining really catastrophic injuries that they might not have survived in the jungle of Vietnam. With that comes the added responsibility to provide long-term care for those warriors who will need assistance in the activities of daily living.
What jumped out to me, what separated Bastion from any other normal community, was the love that I felt.
It was something that stayed on my mind, that there has to be some community for folks like me, like veterans like me, that just coming from war, that just wants to settle in a home where it's other people like me.
We believe that the role of community is critical in the ongoing recovery and reintegration for our warriors and families.
The things that I've encountered here that I receive, I like to reciprocate, I give back. That's what makes Bastion living here great, because if you need the support's here, and if you want to give back, you have that opportunity as well.
Anecdotally, we know Bastion is working because we observe our warriors making these life course transitions. They're going back to school, they're going back into the workforce, starting new careers, they're starting families. They're making that next step, a life that is prosperous and connected, and one in which they are able to continue their service to the country.
So what is Bastion? It's neighbors helping neighbors, where true and lasting change occurs, guided by passionate and dedicated leaders, the unsung heroes of our nation, one of whom we honor today. Therefore, I am so honored to present the George W. Bush Institute Military Service Citation presented to a post-9/11 veteran who has demonstrated exemplary leadership and has continued to practice servant leadership since transitioning. And with that, I'd like to ask Dylan and our 43rd Commander-in-Chief to join me on stage, please. Ladies and gentlemen, the citation reads, Dylan Tête has chosen servant leadership at each stage of his career, following a distinguished record of military service and leadership in combat. He answered his next call to serve. Dylan set forth to build a community equipped with the tools to support the transition of warriors and their families that face the invisible and visible wounds of war. So on this day, April 11th, 2019, let it be recognized that Dylan Tête is cited for his service to a grateful nation and for his works on behalf of those who have worn the uniform of our United States. Ladies and gentlemen, Dylan Tête.
There you go.
Oh my God, thank you. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Mr. President. If I would have known we were going to show that video at the Bush Center, I would have buttoned my shirt. I'm sorry, Mrs. Bush, you had to see on my chest hair. I do want to thank the entire team at the Military Service Initiative. I'm just so proud to stand with you and be a part of the amazing work you're doing, elevating non-clinical interventions like Bastion, which in many cases are proving just as effective as the clinical interventions that promote the healing and reintegration of our warriors. And to my Commander-in-Chief and First Lady, Mr. President and Mrs. Bush, I'm overwhelmed with gratitude, and I humbly receive this recognition on behalf of all my comrades who are living with brain injuries, but whose legacies shall endure, much to your credit and constant devotion to all our warriors and families. Thank you. I am told by many in the industry that if you can build a $13 million supportive housing development in New Orleans, then you can build one anywhere. So we are advancing our own policy initiative in this Congress that will increase access to affordable housing for our most severely injured warriors, thus laying the groundwork for a national expansion, and with any luck, we'll plant 5 more bastions over the next 7 years in strategic locations throughout the United States, so stay tuned. Finally, this honor also belongs to my wife, Annie, a native here of Dallas, who grew up dancing and playing the viola, reading lots of books, and going fishing with her daddy, and doing all the wonderful things that they do in Texas to produce remarkable women. You are by far the most remarkable anything that I've ever encountered in my 41 years on Spaceship Earth. Thank you. Thank you all. I'm very grateful.
Ladies and gentlemen, the military is but one variable that impacts our global stage, and I know we look forward to our next conversation. And as today, this afternoon, we ponder the complexity of our today and tomorrow, please join me in welcoming Dr. Henry Kissinger and our President and CEO, Ken Hirsch.
There we go. Well, thank you so much for being here. I must say that I'm very nervous, and I don't usually get nervous. When I called Dr. Kissinger in the fall and asked him if he'd be here in April, you're my hero. You were booking 9 months out last September. So I think everybody here wants to know, what's your secret?
For what? For surviving? I chose my parents well.
And I want to thank Starkey Hearing Technology for being the sponsor of this really awesome opportunity to hear from really one of the great statesmen that this country's seen. I'd like to start, if you don't mind, with your personal story, because that seems to shape so much about how we view the world. You were born in 1923. You arrived in the U.S. in 1938 at age 15. You went into the Army in 1942 and served until 46. Given that experience, especially serving in the war where you were an intelligence officer, how did that experience shape your worldview as you went into your professional career?
Well, you have to understand, I came to this country as a refugee in 1938. And I lived in New York, working during the day and going to school at night. So my military service was my first contact with American life as a group, because I served in an infantry division, the 84th Infantry Division, which came from Wisconsin and Illinois. And so for me, the Army was my first completely American experience. And I had the honor of serving first in the infantry, and then later on, when we entered Germany, I was moved to the T2 section, which is the intelligence section. So my attitude in academic life, I was at Harvard during the Vietnam period, when there were demonstrations and various kinds of attacks on the then administration. I always had a different view than many of my academic colleagues, based on, in a way, having been rescued from a dictatorship, and then from my Army service with the division, with the 84th Infantry Division. And that had a big impact on my attitude towards the big issues during the rest of my life.
So you stayed in Germany a little bit after the war, and your experience there, I'd like you to comment, because in many respects, your story and the immigration is the ultimate form of globalization. When you look at Europe today, and you look at the rise of leaders for life or the rise of nationalist parties again, do you feel that this populist move that we're witnessing in Europe is the beginning of a repeat of what we saw early in the 1930s and even before that?
Well, of course, I was very young when the fascists developed in Germany. But I think the sense of frustration with the existing institutions is one of the causes for this populist reaction, that the period of inspirational leaders seems to be diminishing. And in a way, the rise of these populist leaders is partly due to the failure, largely due to the failure of the governments that have been in office.
And do you think that the alliances and that the forces around our democratic institutions are strong enough to hold against these threats?
Yes, I do believe that it's that, but the politics in all democracies has become a skill, more of a skill in presentation than a development of convictions. And when that becomes dominant, the public feels that it is really being manipulated. And therefore, they're not willing, they become reluctant to undertake sacrifices. But great things cannot be done without a willingness to sacrifice some of the present for the future, for your children and grandchildren. And when that attitude weakens, then every setback becomes hard to bear.
Right. Now, you have written about one of the challenges of democracy is balancing the long term against the latest public opinion poll. Do you think that true statesmanship in a Twitter world is possible?
Well, you may find it hard to believe. I have never consulted Twitter for anything. So I'm no great expert from that point of view. The essence of statesmanship, as I have understood it, is this: the task of a leader is to bring his society from where it is to where it has never been. And in order to do that, you need vision and courage. You need to be able to imagine what doesn't yet exist, a better future for your people. And then you have to have the courage to withstand the attacks from those that have to alter their attitudes. That, I think, is the essence of statesmanship.
I couldn't agree more. Let's talk about an example that took both vision and courage. In 1971, your and President Nixon's desire, because we had a common adversary in Russia and the Soviet Union, to forge an opening with China. There was a trip to Pakistan. You had reported that you were ill and that you were going to rest. The convoy was a decoy, and you got on the plane to go to Pakistan, with the president of Pakistan to China to meet Zhou Enlai, and spent about 49 hours on the ground talking to him. How challenging that moment of meeting a world leader that we didn't have relations with. There weren't the traditional briefing papers and intelligence reports that are commonplace today. You had to go meet a world leader without the public eye. Explain, in your mind, what that was like.
Well, the first problem we had is when is that President Nixon did not tell anybody in his administration that this trip was taking place. So we could not ask for the normal briefing papers. And the reason President Nixon did that, and people will argue about that, is that in the middle of the Vietnam War, leaking was huge. And he thought that if the effort became public, there would be such a debate about the conditions we should make and that it would never take place. So the first thing was to organize a trip by the security advisor, which we made around Asia, wound up in Pakistan, and then we had arranged with the government of Pakistan to fly us to Beijing. The reason we chose Pakistan is because China was in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, and they had no contact with most countries in the world, and he did have one with Pakistan. So it was difficult. And I was lucky in the sense that Zhou Enlai was a person of some academic attitudes. So if you read the transcripts that are now public of our conversation, it sounds like two college professors talking about the future of the world. And the reason we did that on both sides was the following. There were so many disagreements between China and the United States that if we started with any of them, we could get deadlocked. So we thought the first thing was to establish a way of talking to each other. And so that led to a sort of strange dialogue. I was in China in order to elicit an invitation from them to President Nixon. But I didn't want to say that. And Zhou Enlai didn't want to say that. So I had 48 hours, and we both knew it. So at the end of the second day, as we were breaking up for the evening, Zhou Enlai had some official function. He said, what should we do? What should our staffs do for the evening? I said, well, they can start drafting a communique. And Zhou Enlai said, can they mention the trip which hadn't been mentioned of Nick? And I said, what trip? And he said, both trips, which meant my trip and Nixon's trip. So that was a great breakthrough. But it was a strange setting. And if I may, I had one other problem, which the president will understand fully. I was talking to Zhou Enlai, but I knew that President Nixon wanted to be the first person to see Mao. So most visitors asked to see Mao, and I went through contortions to avoid asking to see Mao. He had given orders, we now know, that to bring me to him if I asked for, as soon as I asked for it. But I never asked for it. So this was the problem of internal relations in our government. And President Nixon was absolutely right in reserve that for himself.
Great. Now you have gone on to say that in the co-evolution between China and the U.S., you said it's very hard to have regular dialogues because when you take a conversation of a typical American president and a typical Chinese president, the American president has 10 issues that he wants to solve. The typical Chinese president has 10 destinations he wants to get. So there's a difference of perspective. Let's talk about today, if you will, where we see Russia and China having some common interests in having a conflicting relationship with us. Do you view the same opening you saw to go reestablish relations with China? Do you see China and Russia being drawn together because of their conflict with us?
Well, in our period.
Today.
Yes, but in the period in which I functioned, there was a obvious conflict between Russia and China. So we calculated that if we could succeed in placing America in a position where we were closer to each of them than they were to each other, that we would have the maximum bargaining position. That was our basic strategy. In the present situation, the United States is in conflict, or in a kind of conflict, with both China and Russia. That, of course, then weakens we cannot then use that relationship as in the same degree, but as a practical proposition for American diplomacy, we should avoid, if we can, being in conflict with two major powers simultaneously that have access to each other. So, but that's a principle we can't always follow.
Do you see that the United States and China, given their competing interests and the rise of China, do you see that coexistence being established peacefully, or do you worry about the theory of a rising power and a declining power always, or not always, usually ending up in a military conflict?
Historically, it has led to conflict because it's the essence of a rising power that it steps on the feet of the established power by the virtue of its increased scope. But we are now in a really historically different position, which is that weapons technology has developed in such a manner, not only with the destructiveness of weapons, but with the artificial intelligence that is evolving among, say, inanimate objects, that to unleash the full capabilities of either side on the other would have an impact, in my opinion, equal or greater than what destroyed Europe 100 years ago. So I believe it will be a task of any president to see whether he can find an honorable way of avoiding a major war with China, but at the same time to prevent China to use that restraint from expanding its influence in a threatening manner. That's a huge task. President Bush dealt with it in his period, and it's become more acute since.
And you were quoted as saying once that the difference between Russians and the Chinese, this is what you said to President Nixon, the difference between the Chinese and the Russians is that if you drop some loose change, when you go to pick it up, the Russians will step on your fingers and the Chinese won't. Do you think we can have a three-way trusting relationship between the three powers that be today?
If you mean by trusting a relationship like exists among people in America.
Well, let's call it an equilibrium, a stable equilibrium.
It's a big challenge. And it's very difficult because in the nature of things, politics never stands still. So new issues come up all the time. But the world is now evolving in such a way. In my 95th year, I've become fascinated by the problem of artificial intelligence. for this reason, and have started some groups that address this, because our leaders now have an unprecedented challenge, which is that inanimate objects become part of the equation. So that has to be clearly understood. And the traditional pattern of diplomacy and foreign policy, in which countries faced each other in a series of showdowns, it's particularly difficult and for a country of the magnitude of the United States to apply. So I think we have to rethink our strategic approaches. And this is why institutes like this one here can raise issues that in a day-to-day operation you don't get to so easily. But it's one of the key issues of our period.
And you wrote a fantastic article entitled How the Enlightenment Ends. You wrote that last year in The Atlantic. And you said information threatens to overwhelm wisdom. And when you were talking about the critique of artificial intelligence and the lack of human judgment, with that rise, do you feel like diplomacy and statesmanship is losing its place?
No, it's not losing its place. In a way, it has a bigger place, but it has to be restudied. And it has to be understood now that the traditional way of military confrontation, especially between countries of the magnitude of China and the United States, have to be reconsidered. And one has to think, we still have to think of a kind of containment of the aggressor. But the containment has to be more subtle and take into account more factors than has been the
and
case.
do you worry as you think about rolling back technology, we have certain actors, China in particular, that's using big data and artificial intelligence as a means of population control with their social credit system. And then you have the people that approach technology as the ultimate democratic tool of transparency. Do you believe that we can reach some common understanding as to how to put that toothpaste back in the tube and really control it rather than let it get out of control?
How you change the historic attitudes of societies. I mean, China, this is not just a problem of a leader. In China, you have a society which for thousands of years has been educated that service to the society is the overwhelming necessity. And therefore, it is part of their DNA. We have been fortunate of having a very humane environment, and so we have been able to concentrate on our immediate problems. Chinese think more of that will take a while to adjust. And I have a view that not everybody shares, which is we cannot change directly the domestic structure of a historic society, but we have to live with it in a world but we can also not turn the world over to it. And how to navigate this is what I'm assigning to this center.
To the center. Thank you. We'll take that on tomorrow. So if you were to advise a young person today, would you advise them to study computer science or humanities?
I'm not a good person to ask that question because I'm an argument against universal suffrage in my knowledge of computer science. But I would, as a general rule, say the society must have a basis of humanistic knowledge. Of course, they have to know computer science, but I take that for granted. But you cannot handle the global implications of computer science if you don't understand a humanistic tradition.
Good. I'd like to shift gears and talk about a dilemma and see if you can help shed some light. Today, Iran has been described as a murderous regime, and we need our alliances. One of our allies in the region is Saudi Arabia. Yet the Khashoggi murder, as well as the human rights and humanitarian issues in Yemen, as a result of the war, make it difficult for us to be all in on that alliance, yet we need to have some commonality relative to a common adversary. How would you advise that we navigate that dilemma?
First of all, I don't want to leave the impression that I have an answer to every dilemma that a president faces. And there's some dilemmas that are not easy. A basic problem of Saudi Arabia is that it is historically a feudal society put together through agreement among various tribes. And so it has a tradition of government based on these realities. That is, in many of its manifestations, deeply offensive to us. And there is no way we can accept acts like the Khashoggi. And if it became a typical pattern, it would make our relationship extremely difficult. Now, the Crown Prince, who is responsible for the murder, at least indirectly, he's also trying to modernize the country, which means he's trying to move its feudal structure into a more modern, bureaucratically organized. So we are bound to be in dilemmas along the way. And we have legitimate objectives in the security of Saudi Arabia, but we also have traditional views in which we cannot condone assassinations of this type as a method of government. And every administration has to work this out to some extent. If Saudi Arabia disintegrates, we will be in for a long period of chaos. And no president can forget that. But if Saudi Arabia doesn't modernize, it might disintegrate. So it will always, I don't know how to answer that, except to be conscious of it and to what I think we need with dilemmas like this is a recognition in our country that serious people are trying to deal with grave problems and not turn every domestic debate into an issue of a moral failing of the leaders, so that we can learn from the debates and not torture ourselves by saying it is a kind of a civil war.
And so speaking of leadership, you've had relationships with some of the world's greatest leaders in the last 50 years. This is a forum on leadership. What, in your mind, are a couple of the essential traits to great leadership today? And who, in your mind, embodied those traits as a great leader? And people in the room are okay to reference.
Well, as I've said before, the combination of vision and courage are two elements. I did not know President Bush when he was elected, or barely knew him. I have developed enormous admiration and affection for him. And I always list him among the top leaders for that reason. He inherited an extraordinarily difficult situation that had all the elements that I've described here. And he made the difficult decisions. And he, even when common sense on the short term would tell him that they were very dangerous, and he did it with serenity and not ill will towards his opponents. And so I came here today for 3 hours and an 8-hour plane trip and consider it an honor to have been asked.
Thank you for that. Our goal here is to create content that has great take-home value. I'm going to end it on that wonderful comment about vision and courage and the cautionary tales of how we need wisdom in a day of high technology. It's an honor to have you here. I want to thank again the Starkey Hearing Technologies Company for being an underwriter of this great conversation. It's an honor for me to share a stage with you. Everything we've heard this morning has been live streamed and will be on our website if you want to reference it again. And I look forward to seeing everybody this evening at the gala at the mansion on Turtle Creek. Dr. Kissinger, you're a national treasure, and I want to thank you so, so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. Welcome to Studio 43. My name is Matthew Rooney. I'm the Managing Director of the George W. Bush Institute SMU Economic Growth Initiative. As my colleague Laura Collins mentioned earlier, we are a joint venture with SMU, which we actually announced a year ago at this event on the big stage. We have developed that in the meantime on top of the work that the Bush Institute had been doing for several years before that, which had focused on globalization and immigration and how they drive innovation and lead to a thriving economy for the United States. With our friends at SMU, we've added to that the ability to talk more about domestic constraints on growth. And in particular, we've begun to develop an approach to addressing what we perceive as a slowdown in the upward mobility machine that has characterized the United States for so long, and which we think, a development that we think has important implications for our ability to grow into the future. Welcome to Studio 43. We're here, we're here in this setting, which is intended to be a more informal setting than the big stage, designed to help us focus not just on the celebration of leadership, which the Forum on Leadership is designed to do, but also on how new trends are emerging and how foundations are being laid today that will be turned into transformations in the way we live. Our motto, transformations and foundations. We want to look at what's happening today that could be transformational in the future. And as we thought about our themes, in the other room, they're talking about technological transformations and threats. In this room, we want to talk about space and its economic opportunities and implications. We tried to ask ourselves, what is likely to be on page one a decade from now or 2 decades from now? We want to send you home today with some new information, things that you didn't already know, and information that we hope will strengthen your ability to understand what's happening and through your own exercise of leadership, shape the future. You know, as I was thinking about today's event and preparing for today's event, it struck me that Americans used to talk about space travel and space exploration all the time. When I was a kid, we watched Star Trek and Lost in Space. We all stopped for a whole day and listened to the transmission of Neil Armstrong's small step on the moon. And there was the tragedy of Challenger, which transfixed us all. In my own experience of that, I saw it unfold on a television over a bar in the Ivory Coast, where I was stationed as a junior foreign service officer. And one of the things that struck me about that moment is my European and African friends that were watching there with me, who had embraced our quest as their own, wept with us at that moment. And then the whole topic just kind of slipped off the agenda. I guess it had started to become kind of routine. And so the irony is that when it became routine, it started to become commercially viable. And that's when the fun really begins. And so what we want to do today is resume that conversation, put this idea back on the top of our agenda. And we've invited two of the area's leading thinkers and doers to help us do that. Ariane Cornell, who is head of astronaut strategy and sales at Blue Origin, and Sean O'Keefe, professor at Syracuse University and former administrator of NASA, just to name 2 points in a remarkable biography. I encourage you to read it and look it up. So in just a moment, please have a seat. I want to open the stage, turn over the stage to Sean and Ariane. Sean will kick off the conversation. But before I do that, I just want to warn everybody that toward the end of today's session, we're going to take questions from the floor. And so that'll be your opportunity to clarify any remaining doubts with these two experts. I encourage you not to miss that opportunity. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Sean and Ariane. Sean, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. And thank you all for coming this afternoon. I think exactly as you've just teed it up and introduced the topic, this has been a remarkable transition, and I think we're at the verge right now of seeing some incredible demonstrations of that new developments that have been coming forward for some time. And in preparing a little bit for this discussion, I recall very vividly an opportunity back in January of 2004 when President George W. Bush came to the NASA headquarters and announced a vision for space exploration. And what he laid out was not so much we're going to go to this place or go to that place or somewhere else, as much it was we have to develop the capacity to go anywhere that we see opportunities present themselves to be able to deal with and actually go engage in those kind of exploratory efforts. And so this exploration notion, the way he defined it in 2004 in the wake of the Columbia tragedy, was to really define what the strategy of the agency would be, what NASA should be focused on, what the agenda should be of going beyond low Earth orbit, which is where we have largely been restricted since the end of the Apollo era, and to now venture beyond that and understand where those opportunities to really expand our horizons and our capabilities could take us. And so part of what he outlined as well was the notion that in the course of this time, much like what we've seen in every commercial transition that's ever occurred here of new developments, is the capacity then to take that technology as each step occurs and make it more freely available for the purpose of taking so many of the commercial operations, for example, the resupply to the International Space Station, which has now been operating continuously for almost 2 decades and currently has 7 members aboard, and it's there 24/7, 365, operating in a way that then requires constant resupply and crew exchange and everything else that would go along with that. This is an opportunity now to take advantage of the commercial developments that have been occurring within the market space to look and identify those market opportunities as well as others that stem from this to really take over that activity and then free up that public focus towards that broader exploration set of goals. Where do you want to go? What is it we want to deal with? What are the kind of technologies we need in order to get there? And so in many ways, what we've seen, I think, happen here is the emergence of a commercial industry, in large measure because of that vision and the very advocacy of the policies that were put in place during his time as president, that then in turn made this a much more attractive feature. What we see today, I think, as well, is seeing the extraordinary acceptance of those opportunities and the entrepreneurs and visionaries within the market space who have really started to put some construct to that. Last year at this very forum, Jeff Bezos was here and articulated his broader view of exactly why his notion of the framework for what Blue Origin's all about should be pursued. And it's something that, again, others in the market space are also doing many other pursuits, but this uniquely is one in which he's dedicated a purpose, a strategy, a focus, and an intent. And I think in many ways, Ariane, tell us what Blue's doing these days and where the things are that are coming in the time ahead that really ought to, and I think will, excite us all to see where those opportunities will take us.
Sure, happy to get into that. And first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Hopefully you all caught the video that was just playing. That, of course, was the voice of our founder, Jeff Bezos. And let me tell you, he, as well as everybody that works at Blue, is extraordinarily passionate about what we're doing. And our vision at Blue Origin is millions of people living and working in space. So obviously that's a pretty long-term vision. That's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. But key to it is reusability and accessing space. What we want to do eventually when we're living and working in space, if it's in what we call low Earth orbit, like where the International Space Station is, what if we could get some heavy industry off of this planet? What if we could basically have the planet be for residential and light industrial, right? We've been to all the planets, and by far Earth is definitely the best place to be. There shouldn't really be a plan B, right? So how can we do that? How can we harness also the resources of space, whether it's solar, whether it's minerals? But the only way that we're going to be able to do that is by lowering the cost of access to space. The International Space Station has been extraordinary, but it's very expensive to go up and back, unless you get reusable rockets. And not just reusable rockets, you've probably heard that. Reusability is a big hot term in our industry these days. But we focus on what's called operational reusability. So how do you build effective and efficient operations and maintenance of the rockets into the system from the very beginning? You know, the space shuttle, for example, was a reusable vehicle. But it was a lot of time and effort to refurbish the vehicle and then send it back up. I'm going to show you a video here in a second of one of our main rocket right now that's flying. It's called New Shepard, named after Alan Shepard, first American in space. When we fly this rocket, it takes low tens of thousands of dollars to turn the rocket around. That is pennies in comparison to the cost of actually building a rocket. And so we'll, you know what, without further ado, why don't I show you New Shepard? Let's roll that video, please.
Command start. And liftoff.
Actually, can I get my mic? So just a little bit of commentary over it. So this rocket, New Shepard, we've flown it successfully 10 times. Only on the second mission, we landed it. So there you see a landing of a rocket. We fly the rocket up over 100 kilometers, 330,000 feet, so 10 times higher than what you all flying in commercial jets these days, and we brought the rocket back to land. So the first organization to ever do that. Our intent with New Shepard is to put people on top of that rocket in that crew capsule you just saw landing there. Currently, we have scientific experiments, customers that are already flying on New Shepard. We have university customers, we have international customers, we have industries, whether it's organizations that just need a little bit of zero-G to prove out a technology, or they're trying to do some bioexperiment. But we also, for example, have school kids, elementary schools that are flying experiments with us. We are already lowering the cost of accessing to space. And New Shepard is really our first step in this big, broad vision that we've talked about. Later this year, though, we will be putting people on top of the rocket. What we'd like to do is this is going to be a space tourism vehicle. You see 6 windows. Those are the largest windows that have ever flown in space. So as opposed to the small windows that you see on your airplane, your commercial airplane, these are like the size of the windshields on your car. And 6 seats, 6 windows, so no fighting in space, anybody. And you see there that's a cushion of air that we fired just at the last second to cushion your return from space. Actually, we fly it out of West Texas, so about 2 to 3 hours from El Paso. And it's going to be pretty extraordinary when we start putting people on top of that. So that's step 1. And I hope that you guys all come for a flight on New Shepard. We're really trying to open up space for everybody with this rocket. Then step 2, though, will be a rocket called New Glenn. And New Glenn is our big orbital rocket, right? So this smaller rocket goes up to 100 kilometers and basically comes straight back down. The orbital rocket is going to be bigger, more powerful, and it's going to escape Earth's gravity well to go to low Earth orbit. Again, that's where the International Space Station is. It'll go up to higher orbits, like geostationary orbit, which is where a lot of our satellites live. And it'll go to the moon as well. And we can talk about that in a moment. That's going to be our workhorse rocket for decades to come. And it is taking the lessons from New Shepard and integrating them into a larger system. So our motto is Gradatum Ferociter, step by step ferociously. And that's what we're doing, step by step.
Sure. Well, it's in a lot of ways, too, with this patterns, it's exciting to see the developments here in such short order, is exactly the same pattern that we've seen that developed commercial aviation. The means for any of us to get aboard an airplane and fly nearly anywhere we want to on this planet This was something that was just an absolute pipe dream on the part of folks several generations back, to be sure. But look at the amount of time it took in order to develop each of those individual stages, where it first was motivated by a couple of folks who decided this would be a really interesting idea to try, that then turned into more of a public objective, that yielded capacity that was accelerated because of the conditions of entry into a world war for the first time during that century, that then made this capacity of aviation possible to access in a wholly different way. It then made the opportunity in this country, for sure, and across the world in many ways, post-war period, the opportunity to exploit that technology for the purpose of accessing more remote parts of our own nation state, to develop, expand, utilize capacity more extensively than what we're able to do by conventional transport means. And all those steps along the way then yielded the beginnings of a commercial industry, where airlines came along to take us from here to there to visit folks on holidays or do anything else that is part of the occasion. All of that, though, is a function of how fast technology can move. And it's been rapidly accelerating. The principle of Moore's law is absolutely true. It'll accelerate and expand exponentially on its insertion into product, and in turn, the cost will decline by each interval and intervention that are made at each chapter in order to achieve that. And here we have been in space for the better end of 60 years. So as a consequence, we're now following this pattern very impressively. The commercial opportunities are coming along. The people with a vision of what they would do and how they would take advantage of those continuing expansions are beginning to really form up. And again, Jeff Bezos is leading that charge in so many ways with his own kind of view of what's there, and recruiting people who really believe that this is feasible, that anything that you look at from that standpoint can be an achievable objective if you utilize this same phenomenon. But in many ways, it is created by virtue of just a dramatic development of technologies. And since that time that President Bush articulated his vision 15 years ago, the technology has changed multifold since that time, made every one of the developments we're talking about today feasible to do, and for NASA to continue with its efforts for space launch capabilities that would go beyond low Earth orbit and continue to exploit that. So the combination of what we see both within Blue Origin, other companies, SpaceX, et cetera, Orbital ATK has still been involved in lots of resupply back and forth to the space station, and what NASA is doing directly through its efforts, as well as Boeing. You're going to see a wide range of demonstration of capabilities, I think, over the course of these next couple of years that's going to re-energize and reignite that interest that you referred to in the opening. I think that we're going to see more frequently the opportunities to work with that because of that visionary commitment.
I might tack something
Please.
on there. I think that I think we are in fact going to see kind of this exponential growth come from space. And why is that? I think one is by opening access to space, which, as I said, lowering the cost of access to space through reusable rockets is very important. But just think about it. There have only been 550 people that have ever gone into space.
Yeah, that's it.
What we want to do is get more people up there to see what you can do with the resources of space, to think about what are all these companies, what are all these sorts of ways that we can use space. The possibilities are endless, but there's a very key step, which is, again, lowering the cost of accessing to space. But we've already proven that it's doable. There's more iterations to come on that. But we are really on the brink of something very special.
Yeah, I mean, one of the major technology limitations we're still chipping at, trying to figure out how to work through, and it's been a long, enduring issue, is just how to get off this planet. I mean, again, as Ariane said, so much of what is unique about what they're doing at Blue Origin is the capacity to lift off of this planet using, interestingly, calling it Shepard. All right. It's the same chemical propulsion methodology that Alan Shepard employed to leave this planet as well. And that is to get out of the grip of the Earth's gravitational pull. What it used to take is 90% of all the fuel you're carrying with you. So anytime you saw a shuttle launch, as reusable as that was, within the limits of the definition, it would come back, and yes, you could refurbish it and send it again. 90% of all the fuel it took was expended in the first 8.5 minutes. Once it hit low Earth orbit and into the space atmosphere, you were down to the minimalist amount of energy that it would have to continue operations, other than just relying on basic principles of orbital mechanics and laws of physics. Anything's going to travel at a speed once you set it into that orbital condition, once it leaves the Earth's atmosphere. And so that is a real limitation on how far you can go, how much you have to take with you in order to achieve any kind of exploratory effort. And that's what, in so many ways, Blue is really knocking down those kinds of limitations, and on the cusp now, I think, of developing different energy and propulsion sources for the means to leave this planet and go somewhere else to do the exploring and not have to worry about, carrying an awful lot of mass and volume with you in order to achieve this. Much of that, I think, is part of the current public debate that was further enunciated about 2 weeks ago here with the Vice President's statements at a Space Council meeting that the objective was to get back to the moon by 2024. That's the mark on the wall that the administration now is placing on this. Ariane was just literally at the Space Symposium here, left there this morning to be with us. What is the buzz going on at the symposium in Colorado Springs?
Yeah, it's a good question. So this is kind of our big annual, the top annual space conference for the industry. And yes, the moon is certainly at the center of the dialogue again, coming out of President Pence's proclamation that we're going to be putting people back on the moon by 2024. And from the Blue Origin perspective, we're very excited about this. So we have New Glenn that we were talking about, which is going to be the bigger rocket. But another program that we've announced is something called Blue Moon. So a couple of years ago, we said we are going to be building a lunar lander. So we're looking forward to supporting that, and not just going to the moon, tag you're it, and then coming back home. We really want to go there to stay. There are resources there that are interesting. If we want to go further to Mars, to other destinations beyond that, understanding how do you live and survive off planet Earth for longer periods of time is very important. So that's definitely on our roadmap, and very excited that we can support the U.S. in getting back to the moon.
That's fantastic. And the discussion, I guess, out at the Space Symposium was all around that topic primarily?
Yes, indeed. And also, how do we accelerate it? I think that is definitely a challenge. You of all people understand the balance. Well, we all in the space industry understand the balance between the speed of innovation, the cost, of course, and of course the amount of risks that you want to take. So how do we optimize the American space industrial base, which is so strong? It is very strong, and we are still the world leader in this. Don't let anybody fool you on that one. And how do we get ourselves back there? And take this thing forward? Obviously, it's the 50th anniversary of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin's steps on the moon. There's so much more that we can do, and we want to be part of that using our upgraded technology.
Mm-hmm. In so many ways, the last of the Apollo flights in 1972 culminated with a grand total of 12 people who have ever been to the moon. And every one of them can attest, unlike the hoax theories, can attest to the fact that, yes, it really does exist, and we really did go there. I mean, to settle that one fairly quickly. But it is a capacity and a remarkable capability, I think, to think about, we got to that stage, and then we really could not decide what to do next. There was so much of a debate over what are the next avenues we got to pursue. Lots of other commitments going on this planet that we felt were higher order of magnitude relative to anything like that. What we're seeing today, and the significant, I think, huge importance of what Ariane has talked about in terms of reducing the cost of access, has made this, again, just the same way that commercial aviation was and can become, ultimately, down the road, in which this was only for a very limited number of people who could engage in commercial flight. Now, we can all pick up, go on down to DFW, and pick the destination where you want to go, within reason, okay? But it nonetheless is something that's accessible. That is the achievability that is feasible. It's right within range of doing this, because there are folks who are so dedicated to how do we do this on a repetitive basis, how do we do it for substantially lower cost of access, and make it accessible to more people along the way. And that's ultimately what the objective can be, and that's why I think this particular objective is not only achievable in this next several years, we've got the technology, and it's substantially better than anything they were dealing with at the time they were envisioning going to the moon for the first time. This was considered to be, an audacious challenge that was absolutely outside the scope of what they could achieve in 1962. When John F. Kennedy uttered this, it was like, what? I mean, this is going to take much more than what we ever could have imagined. They did it in almost 7 years.
Can I give a couple of concrete examples of
Please.
where we're probably headed with this? So, so as Sean was saying, why is this so, we went to the moon and then what? Each one of these big programmatic decisions, we had to stop and think a lot about it, because we were going to invest billions in lots of people's time and many years. Compare that to how, for example, the Silicon Valley works. Where the key is the MVP, minimum viable product. Build it, get it out. Oh, it broke? Okay, no, let's make a tweak, let's go again. Iterate, 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 iterate. We can't do that in space when it costs so much money to get up there and get back. So what are some, again, concrete things that we're seeing already? One, already I showed you with New Shepard. We already have universities, for example, that are flying an experiment. By the way, you get 3 to 4 minutes of very clean micro-Gs up there, which our scientists love. They do the experiment, they get it back. By the way, they get to go out to the capsule and check out the results within minutes or an hour of when it's landed. They can see the results, they tweak the experiment, and they're flying again within a couple of months. And by the way, once we're starting to fly regularly, that can be on a daily, if not weekly occurrence. How do we expand that into Earth's orbit? Right now, or traditionally anyway, if we had satellites, we'd send up huge, what we call huge birds, huge satellites. We're talking thousands of tons, 6,000 tons, 7,000, 9,000+ tons, 1,000 pounds, kilograms, that is. But what you're seeing now is this new trend towards constellations. Constellations are good of satellites, much smaller satellites. They're good from a security standpoint, right? Because there are multiple, there's not just a couple of big juicy targets, so it's good from a national security standpoint. But it's also good from a technical development standpoint. So if you have a big satellite, currently what they're doing is you design these satellites to live 10, 15, 20 years. By the way, it takes 3+ years to design and build these things. So by the time you launch them, they're already technically obsolete. Mm-hmm. So, but if they're going to be 10, 15, 20 years up there, that makes sense that you invest that, and by the way, hundreds of millions of dollars. You go to this constellation model, you throw up a lot of the smaller satellites into a lower orbit, which means gravity is going to pull them in. You want to launch more. Mm-hmm. And by the way, they're also going to be, you're going to get a better, quicker iteration on the technology. But again, the only way that that happens, right now they can do rideshare because they're smaller satellites. They can go up on rockets that are taking up the big ones, so that's how they lower their cost. But what we want to do is be able to launch satellites, other infrastructure up there at a lower cost so that you can iterate more quickly, get better technology up there, so that we can all have better life here on Earth, and eventually for your great-grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, your great-grandchildren can do a lot more in space and take advantage of the resources that are up there.
Absolutely.
So this is great. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add one other trailing point. The relevance, too, of right where Ariane's left this commentary, of why the lunar surface then becomes attractive, is if you can get there, you can get off of that particular rock a lot easier than this one, because it's 1/6 of the gravity. So if you can set up the infrastructure, the capacity to do the resupply, all the basic things we now know how to do. The technology has made it feasible for advanced and agile manufacturing to be incorporated just about anywhere now. You can replicate almost anything in any other location and do not require big foundries and everything else anymore. So that consequence is really recent. This is a development of technology that's made this possible, that then makes that a fascinating place to be able to stage from, to get from there elsewhere, and to be able to do the kinds of things that Ariane's talking about on a multiple scales as a consequence of it, rather than just relying on, you're going to spend 3 years and an awful lot of money, put it up there and hope it stays and operates really well for 20 years. Those days are over. Sorry.
The conversation is not over, however. There's a lot left to be said. Obviously, that was great. I think I certainly learned a lot of things. So we now have a few moments to take questions from you all. And we have a couple of mic runners. Ma'am?
It's fascinating hearing about the technology to get to a destination and back. But as far as the human being putting people in space, I understand that the Earth frequencies that feed our bodies, our bones, our circulatory system, I know that there's a technology that the Germans have provided to make our NASA astronauts undergarments because they have Earth frequencies. And I'm wondering what kind of thinking or development has gone into what the human body needs to be able to be sustained in space and not have, repercussions with aging and with the bones.
Mm-hmm. That's a terrific question. It's one that really, in many ways, was a focal point of why the International Space Station was developed and ultimately assembled, among many reasons to do so. But this was one of the factors. It was looking at the biophysical kind of consequence of long-duration spaceflight. Most trips had been, with some exceptions here and there, were typically in matters of weeks. With the International Space Station, this now became 6-month missions, and to include the famous Mark Kelly, who everybody probably remembers here, his twin brother was here on the Earth, who's also an astronaut, and Mark was on board the International Space Station for a year to measure what the consequence is on your biophysical condition. And it was profound. When we first started, NASA first started this effort, and all the international players, the Canadians, the Russians, the European Space Agency, and the Japanese, all forged together to build the International Space Station more than 20 years ago. The consequences of longer duration spaceflight were really profound. Now that's been, over that 20 plus, nearly, years of time, they've developed a wide range of capabilities to mitigate all those effects. And there are still several factors that are within requirement to figure out how to deal with, but it is a much more manageable proposition by virtue of medication as well as physical regimen, a wide range of different changes in the very the habitat that they're in, the kind of suits that they've made for them, all the different things that have gone into this has been a consequence of that experimentation over that many years, in addition to the scientific research they do on a board station.
I'll just add something quickly to that, which is, so Sean in particular and you are talking mostly about orbital space flight.
Right.
But again, step by step, ferociously, if you guys come flying with Blue Origin, that flight is a suborbital flight. So there are things that we've put into the design of the spacecraft to actually make it relatively benign. And frankly, we have what we call a shirt sleeve environment, which means literally you all could come flying with us right now in what you're wearing. No, no helmet, just what you're wearing. Now, we're going to give you a pretty cool flight suit, because who doesn't want to go to space in a cool flight suit? Put it up on your wall, in your office, or whatever it may be. But for example, one of the things that we've done is the seats that you fly in. You saw some quick snippets of them in that video just a moment ago, but you're actually in almost a reclined position. What that does is, as you experience the G's increase on the way up, which by the way are only about 3 G's, it's not that bad, it's basically dispersing it across your body. So what does that mean? So 3 G's, let's say you're 100 pounds, you feel 3 G's standing up, it's going to feel like you're 300 pounds on your head, which is bad for your back, it's bad for your joints. But if you're reclined, it feels basically like the 300 pounds is dispersed across your body, which is not that bad. And then on the way back in, just a little blip at about 5 G's, and then it's nice and soft. So there are things that we've done in the design of the capsule to make sure that that space really is open for all from a physiological standpoint as well.
So I think we have time for one more question before sending anybody on the way. I saw this hand first, sir. Sorry, George.
Actually, my question was, that was going to be my question, but I'm going to add to it. Beyond microbial, has there ever been any life created outside the Earth's atmosphere or gravity?
It has been dominantly microbial in the context of all the experimentation, the vegetation that's been grown on the International Space Station. I mean, this has become a great platform for a lot of that. Beyond that, I'm not aware of anything, but at the same time, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. That's for sure.
So I wish I didn't have to, but I have to call the session to a close. This has been terrific. Thank you very much. I learned a lot. I hope that's true for everyone. Thank you. So we're now taking a short break. There's snacks in the lounge next door. There's obviously restrooms. We'll gather back at the auditorium in 20 minutes' time, 2:15, for the presentation of the George W. Bush Institute Military Service Citation and our keynote conversation with Dr. Henry Kissinger, both presented by Starkey Hearing Technologies at 2:15. Thank you very much.